let's talk about the graphs. I've been getting that question a lot. How do I create smooth movements for my edits? And I think it's easier than you'd expect. So that's what we're gonna cover today. I got already a 3D scene prepared, so we're gonna work with this. So here we have the camera, here we have a null object that is controlling the movement. So I'm gonna hit P for the null, create a keyframe for position, then move to the very end, and we're gonna get closer to the text, just like that. So that's a very linear movement. Pretty boring, nobody really should use that. So the first thing we need to do is select both keyframes, right click, keyframe assistant, and easy ease. If we select these two keyframes and move to the graph editor over here, I'm gonna fit the graph, you're gonna notice kind of a mountain. By the way, it's worth mentioning that we can either edit the graph in the speed graph or in the value graph. Value graph is a bit more complicated because as you can see, we got 3 graphs and we only keyframed 1 value. So basically editing in the speed graph is just much easier and you can still create all the crazy movements. Value graph just gives you a little bit more freedom and flexibility with creating the graphs. But for now, since we easy ease the keyframes, we got the most basic graph there is, which is kind of a mountain. It low-key starts slow in the beginning, then it has a climax in the middle, and then the movement is finishing pretty slowly. But honestly, I never really use that graph because it's simply boring. So if we select the keyframe, you're gonna notice that 2 yellow handles popped up. And these handles will allow us to influence the movement. We'll be able to control where it's fast and where it's slow. So one of the most basic graphs that I use is selecting the second point and creating peak on the left. So that graph is essentially gonna start slow, but for a very short second, and then it's gonna have a climax right in the beginning, and it's gonna have a lot of time to slow down. So that's one of the graphs I really use a lot. The second one would be creating a peak in the middle. So if I drag that handle to the middle, I'm gonna take the second yellow dot and make the peak a little smaller. We're gonna notice that our movement starts slow in the beginning, then has a climax in the middle, and then slows down. That's a pretty cool movement. So we've created a peak on the left, in the middle, and now let's create a peak on the right, just like that. And you can tell that it starts very slowly in the beginning and then the climax is at the end. But now the steeper the mountain, the more intense it's gonna be in the climax. So let's take an example of the mid graph. So here we have that basic movement, but if we were to make the mountain a little bit steeper, which means that we would squeeze in these 2 dots to the very middle, just like that, we would have a very sharp pull in the middle. We could squeeze it even more and create a very sharp peak, just like that. Let's check it out. So we got an extremely slow beginning, it's barely noticeable. Then we have kind of a slingshot, and then we're going back to that very slow movement. So that's already looking pretty cool. And before we move on, I just wanted to let you know that I'm running The Editing Shift, a shop with video editing digital assets. So if you want to supply yourself with drag and drop assets for all the editing platforms, or assets specifically for After Effects that will allow you to spice up your edits and save you a lot of time, then check out the link in the description. Alright, back to After Effects. So now let's say we wanted to create a transition between scene A and scene B, and we would want to start very slow and then at the very end have that slingshot. So all we need to do is drag that right yellow dot to the right, just like that. So that way we're gonna have that fast movement at the very end. And if you take a closer look at this, our movement has finished right over here at that very position. So we got 1 still frame before the transition. So the fix for this is just moving that keyframe 1 frame forward. And that way everything is still moving on the last frame. You can tell by the motion blur. But the thing with movements like that is rather squeezing in the keyframes a bit more, because since the distance between these 2 is too long, it's just gonna ease off this graph. So a simple fix for this is basically squeezing in the keyframes. So now the movement is a bit sharper, but the problem is that we got no movement over here. Here we already have an animation, so it kind of doesn't make sense, but we're gonna work with this either way. I'm gonna hit S for scale, create a keyframe in the very beginning of our layer, and then somewhere here we're gonna increase the scale to create another keyframe. I know it doesn't make sense, but it's just to showcase it. So I'm gonna select these 2 keyframes, easy ease them, go to the graph editor, and we're gonna create a very sharp peak on the left. So that's basically a letter L. So now it makes a lot more sense. Obviously we could make it more seamless by adding opacity keyframes or just basically adding a transition on top, but this is basically one of the ways to create that zoom in effect. So now I'm gonna delete all these keyframes, and let's say we're gonna create a very subtle movement going forward. Something like that. We're gonna select these 2 keyframes, easy ease them, go to the graph editor, and we're just gonna create a very subtle movement like that. The steeper the peak, the more intense the movement will be at the very climax. But if we want to make a subtle movement, we would just make it less steeper, like that. So that's pretty smooth. I'll probably just increase the value for the second keyframe to get closer, and we could adjust it, make it even less intense. So with that knowledge, you can already create sick movements, but we're not finished yet. I also want to cover the value graph. So for this, we're gonna create the movement for the text. So I'm gonna set a keyframe for position. Then with the Y value, we're gonna move lower just like that. And somewhere here, we're gonna move upwards. So basically we're moving from the bottom to the top. So that's how it's looking with the basic movement. Nothing special. So we're gonna easy ease the keyframes, move to the graph editor. And here my goal is to basically create a fast movement in the beginning, then slow in the middle so the text stops somewhere here, and then it's gonna go up very fast again. We could do it here by simply bringing up that keyframe and creating a letter U with the second point. But it's really hard to adjust here that way. So that's kind of the movement I was going for, but I feel like it's not really looking right. So for this, we're gonna easy ease the keyframes again, and we're gonna move to the value graph. And here, as you can see, we got 3 graphs and we can't really do anything with them. They don't have these yellow handles. So what we need to do is separate dimensions. So I'm gonna right click the position, click separate dimensions, and now we got separate graphs for X, Y, and Z. So currently the movement I've created is only in the Y position. So we can hold Control, click Z, and X, and that way we got only one graph. So what I'm gonna do here is select both points and easy ease them. You can do it by hitting F9, and our yellow handles popped up. By the way, if you hold Control and use your scroll wheel, then you will be able to see more. So here on the left side, you will see the values for our position. So our movement starts at 3000 and then goes all the way down to -500. So for example, if we wanted to create a peak in the middle, we would just simply drag that dot over here and then this one to the other side, and it's our mid graph, but obviously that's not the look we're going for. If I just quickly go back to the speed graph, you're gonna notice that we created the same graph as before. So to put it simply, the flatter the line over here, the slower the movement will be. Check it out here when I'm moving the playback. You see how the value is moving very slowly? But once we get here, it's changing very fast. And then we're getting back to that slow movement, so the value is changing way slower. But the goal was to stop that text right in the middle. So what we need to do is kind of make it fast here, so the values are changing fast here, then the line is flat somewhere in the middle, and then again it's gonna move very fast. So for this I'm gonna select the first keyframe, and I'm gonna drag that yellow dot downwards. So that's the movement now, which doesn't really make sense. So we're gonna grab the other yellow dot and create something like that. So the flatter the line in the middle, the slower it will move. So that's the look I was going for, but we could make some adjustments. First of all, I want to see more of the graph, so I'm gonna hold Control and use the scroll wheel, and I'm gonna even extend that panel. So for example, if you take a look at the graph over here, it's not entirely flat, which means that the movement is remained, so the text is constantly moving, even though it's extremely slow. So let's say if I wanted to stop it, I would drag that yellow dot lower and the other one higher. So now somewhere here we got a flat line. So that's getting better, the text has stopped in the middle, but the thing is that it's not in the center. And to stop the text in the center, we would need to move that graph either higher or lower. And in this example, I believe we need to move it lower. So I'm gonna grab that yellow dot, and you'll notice that our text is moving more upwards as I'm dragging it lower. Okay, something like that. And then the problem is that the curve is kind of flat here, but then it's moving back up again. So because of that, our text is gonna move back for a second and then move upwards. So we would need to flatten out the curve. And in order to do it, we would need to drag that yellow dot lower. As you can see, the line is becoming flatter. But the text is too high, so we need to adjust it a little bit. Alright, so now it's perfect. It's stopping in the middle and then it's moving upwards. So that's the movement I wanted to showcase. Hopefully it was an insightful episode. Maybe one day I'll create a tutorial where we're getting into greater detail with this. But for now, that's pretty much it. Check out the link in the description and I'll see you tomorrow. Cheers, guys.